You're obviously concerned about government, which is why you tuned in. Well, there's a word much worse than communism, socialism, fascism. The word is collectivism. You're going to learn about that word and how it disrupts a lot of things and how it's in control all over the place. Our guest is Edward Griffin, and Ed's website is freedomforceinternational.org, and Ed is a regular contributor here at Free Market News. Ed, very good to have you on again.
Thank you very much, John.
Collectivism, Richard.
Yeah, this is kind of a dictionary game, isn't it? Because that word collectivism, although it's certainly in the dictionary, and it was used quite a bit in historical documents, current history documents of a century ago, it's almost vacant from the modern vocabulary. Collectivism, as you just said in your introduction, is the underlying general ideology that is common to so many of the totalitarian systems of modern times. Communism, fascism, Nazism, all three of those have as their underpinning certain common elements to an ideology that really, they're the only things that you should be looking at. The names communism, fascism, Nazism, so are just labels, but they don't describe anything. Collectivism is what we're talking about. So what is collectivism? We don't have time for all of it, but we've been able to identify certain common components. One of them is the idea that the group is more important than the individual, and that the individual, if necessary, must be sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number. Now, as I've said many times, that is something that I learned in school, and I thought it made a lot of sense at that time, because I was told that we were living in a democracy, and in a democracy, isn't it true that 51% of the vote should rule? And that all made sense to me at the time. But forgive me if I repeat myself here for your listeners that may have heard this before, but for those who have just tuned in, this is an important piece of information. A democracy, a pure democracy, is not a good idea. As our founding fathers clearly stated when they created this country, they discussed the merits and demerits of a democracy, and to a man, they said, we do not want a democracy for this country. We want a republic. And they were very emphatic on that. Now that's strange to the modern reader, because don't we have a democracy?
Yes, we have
Isn't a democracy a good thing?
Good
thing. Yeah. Well, let's just analyze for a minute. A democracy is, pure democracy is based on the concept of majority rule. And that's the end of it. And you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there could be plenty wrong with that. And the best example I can think of is a lynch mob. Now, a majority rule there. There's only one dissenting vote, and he's at the end of the rope.
Yes.
Well, a thinker would say, well, wait a minute, we better go back over this. So you come quickly to the decision that the majority should rule, okay, but within certain limitations, not to the extent of denying the rights of the individual or a minority. That should be something that even the majority should not be allowed to do. Because we know from history, and our founding fathers knew from history, that a mob can be a very vicious thing. And it's possible for a demagogue to whip up the passions of a mob and actually sway the majority in moments that would be very destructive of the rights of individuals or minorities. And that's why they wrote the Constitution, which, when you analyze it in general, was a series of limitations on what the majority can do.
Now, if we had a pure democracy, then a mob vote could take place and say, well, people over the age of 72 are a burden. Let us legally put them to sleep, because it would be better for the economy as a whole. And we could vote this type of thing in.
Absolutely, and all they have to do is claim that their action is for the greater good of the greater number. You see, now that's one of the foundations of collectivism. Now, the individualist, on the other hand, and that's the other side of the debate, individualists versus collectivists. The individualist looks at society and says, wait a minute, what is this thing called group? Where is a group? Can you point to a group? Can you see a group? You can't. You can only see individuals. The word group is an abstraction. It's a word concept. It's an image in the mind of something that doesn't really exist. except to the extent that individuals exist. It's like the word forest. There's no such thing as a forest. There are only trees. You can see trees, but you cannot see forests. So it's an abstraction. When you then, therefore, base a political philosophy on an abstraction, and you say that this abstraction has rights that are greater than the individual, you've made a huge mistake, because what you're doing is you're sacrificing this so-called group anyway, but you're doing it one person at a time. And the irony of it is that the leaders of this so-called democracy, or this concept of collectivism, of the superiority of the group, the leaders are making the decisions of what is best for the greater number. They're the ones who are saying that we're going to have to get rid of everybody over 70, or everybody over 60, or everybody we don't like, because we don't like the way they think. Maybe they've got hate crimes or something, or maybe they don't vote Republican, or they don't vote Democrat. We don't like them for some reason, and it's for the greater good of society. We're just going to have to put them in jail or possibly eliminate them. So that's one of the tenets of collectivism, and the individualist says, no, you can't do that. The rights of the individual and the minority must be preserved. Well, there are other things we could talk about, and let's take one more example just to nail this down. Collectivists and individualists generally agree as to what should be done in society. They both want good things for their fellow man, for their families, and for the world. They want peace, security, justice. They want health. They want freedom. Well, I'm not so sure about the collectivist, because he's willing to trade freedom for some of these other things, but they all want good things. Where they differ is how to bring them about. The collectivist says, we'll use force. We'll use coercion. These are good, and by golly, we know they're good. We're smart. Those dumb people out there may not be so smart, and so for their own good, we have the obligation to rule.
Is this what's happening now in the EU? I don't want to digress you, but let's just parallel what's going on.
John, this is happening everywhere in the world.
All right.
This has been happening everywhere in the world for decades. Almost all of the laws that are on our books are as a result of this mentality.
Okay.
We are going to decide what is good for society, or for you folks, and we're not going to give you a choice because you're too darn dumb, possibly, to know that we are right. So we're going to take your choice away from you for your own good. We'll pass a law. The individualist, on the other hand, says, well, I agree with this is a good thing to do, but I believe in freedom of choice. I want to use persuasion, the power of good example, but not coercion. A classic example, harmless example, would be seatbelts. Now, everybody agrees that seatbelts are a good thing. The collectivist says, yeah, they're so good, and you know there are dummies out there that won't put them on. So, let's pass a law, and we're going to put those people in jail if they don't do what we think they should do for their own good. See? The collectivist wants coercion to bring about the good things in society. The individualist says, I think seatbelts are a good idea too, but I don't believe in forcing people to wear them if they're too dumb to not wear them.
Buckle up, it's the law.
It's buckle up, it's the law. So one of the ways you can spot the collectivist mentality is that no matter what it is they're peeved about, they say there ought to be a law. That's their first instinct, is we're going to force people to do things. And the individualist, of course, believes in freedom of choice. Now we can go down the scale, but that's basically what we're talking about. We're talking about principles and not labels. We're not talking about socialism, communism, fascism, or now what is being sold to the American people as Americanism, another word. Boy, has that changed over the past 50 years or 60 years, you know. The Americanism of today is not the Americanism of our founding fathers. It's the Americanism of some of these systems we've been talking about.
Sounds like a user-friendly name. Like you can have two names for a road. We have here 441, which is also State Road 7. You can say collectivism and Americanism. It's how do you want to couch it?
Depends on which word you like. Yeah, right. So that's basically what we're talking about when we use the word collectivism. It's the mentality that government is the solution to all problems, and that government is a constructive good, and it should be used. It's almost in place of one's religion. It's the kind of thing we look to for guidance and salvation. So.
Well, we've allowed government to grow. Have we allowed it, or has it grown on itself? Has our freedom been stolen from us from behind the scenes?
Well, it's kind of a cooperative thing, I think. We've gone to government schools, have we not? Most of us, I did.
Yes.
And so we've been taught that collectivism is a good thing. Collectivism is the instrumentality that brings about big government, and it works the other way around. Big government, if it controls the educational system, can really make sure that the curricula that the students have inculcates in their minds an admiration of collectivism. And it certainly did in mine. It took quite a bit of introspection and reading and challenging for me to break out of that mold, because I was taught some of the things we were just talking about here. So, yeah, I think that the people in government, of course, want to expand their power because that's pretty heady stuff. It's a good job, you might say. Also, they are social engineers. They want to change society. That's part of the collectivist mind. They want to do all these good things for all those dummies out there. So that gives them sort of a personal power that they like. But by the same token, the people themselves fall for the rhetoric about how good this would be for them to have seatbelt laws, for example. Isn't that good? And the folks say, yeah, we think that's good. So they go along with it, you see. So it's sort of a back and forth thing, to the point where many people today cannot imagine what life would be like having to make their own decisions on anything.
Collectivism seems to work along the premise of, well, if we have one good guy at the top running it, then everything's going to be just fine. Doesn't this fly in the face of what the Founding Fathers thought when they drafted the Constitution?
Absolutely. Founding Fathers were very fearful of the king mentality. George Washington had really been offered the position of being a king. Even in those days, you see, most of the people in the American colonies didn't object to the monarchy. They thought a monarchy was fine. They came from Europe where the monarchy was a way of life.
Right.
What they objected to was King George. He was a bad man.
Yes.
And so they thought that the only problem really was King George. So we have to break away from King George and establish our own king.
Right.
Well, fortunately, the men that were drafting the Constitution,
Yes.
the Jeffersons and the Hamiltons and the Washingtons of the period, were extraordinarily wise.
Yes.
It was a most amazing thing that those men who were being given an opportunity to become a new royalty
Sure.
in this country, not only an opportunity, but the people were clamoring for it, they said no. They said, this is not a question of good versus bad men. This is a question of the system. This is the question of the laws or the concept of government. And so they, for the first time in history, drafted a form of government which started to put limitations on the power of the rulers. It's the first time that it had ever been done from the ground up.
So the Declaration of Independence basically was saying all the things wrong with King George III, and Mr. King George III was a collectivist, was he not?
He was a collectivist, but those were still the days where governments ruled primarily by force of arms. That was at the time in history when there was a change being made right after the French Revolution and after the Magna Carta, where the concept of the voice of the individual citizen being important, that was just beginning to surface. And from that point forward in history, of course, it has grown quite a bit. Prior to that, it was just force of arms. If you had a bigger army than the next guy, you were in charge. And the people accepted that. That was just the way it was. They didn't have any idea of self-rule at all. Well, with the advent of the French Revolution and the American Revolution primarily, this really began to change rapidly. And so King George was a collectivist, yes, because even then there were certain aspects of having to obtain the consent of the ruling class, and there was a substantial middle industrial class in England. And already the government was having to be responsive to the will of the people to some extent, which means they had to engineer public opinion. And when you start engineering public opinion, that's when you get into the area of saying, well, we're doing this because of that reason, and you have to come up with a good reason. And the best reason of all is for the greater good of the greater number.
When people stop thinking and stop caring, is that a breeding ground for collectivism?
I think that is not the breeding ground. I think that's the result of it. I think that is what you find as a symptom of it, not the cause of it. People stop caring because they've been told it doesn't make any difference. And not only does it make any difference, they're not important anyway. They could be sacrificed for the greater good of the greater number. So they're taught to focus only on the big picture, society, the future of mankind, and they themselves consider that they are dispensable. I think it's a symptom rather than a cause.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
For the person who has the knowledge about collectivism, prior to coming to this program right now, I want to kind of address this question to the person who doesn't have it in a before and after way. We have a collectivism society here. Europe has one, and the other countries around the world seem to fall into that category as well. The Founding Fathers broke away from King George III, Declaration of Independence, his system, and as you mentioned, collectivism was in there, said, guys, we're not going to do this anymore. So for a brief period of time in the United States, we were operating or trying to operate in a non-collectivism manner, were we not?
Absolutely. The principles of individualism are embedded in the Constitution of the United States, everywhere you look.
Our schools were not government schools. They were what? Private entities?
Unfortunately, from the very beginning, there were some state-sponsored schools. I think that was a violation of common sense, if not the rules of collectivism. But most of the schools were not government-run. They were private schools. They were as a result of communities getting together and all passing the hat to be able to generate enough money to pay for the school marm, this sort of thing. But very quickly it shifted over to being a tax-supported institution, always on the argument that it's for the greater good of the greater number. I mean, wouldn't it be for the greater good of mankind or for the greater good of the country if everyone were educated? And everybody said, well, yes, that would be for the greater good of the country. And so therefore, let's pass a law and, have taxes and we'll make this a government operation. So early on, that crept into our way of life.
Local governments currently today, in this year, small governments, big governments, are they of a collectivism mentality?
Well, I think all governments in the modern world are of a collectivist mentality. I cannot think of an exception, because they're based on the concept of coercion. I mean, that is the nature of government, the use of legalized force to accomplish everything that the laws have decreed shall be accomplished. That's one of the requirements of collectivism. There's very little room left in modern governments for the idea of voluntary compliance, or just setting a standard and saying, come on everybody, let's go with it and meet this goal. There's very little room for that. Wherever you find it, it's usually with the proviso that if you don't do this, then we'll force you. That's always in the background. They say, you can do this voluntarily, but if you don't, then we'll force you. Well, that's not a voluntary offer at all.
We have a radio interview on this website, How to Build a Perfect Country. It deals with the state of New Hampshire. They seem to have more of a free market thinking in that state. And I'm trying to call out now to people, here we have a definition of collectivism. What do we do? How about studying some of the things going on in New Hampshire right now and taking that down to the grassroots level of their communities. How would you inspire someone to take kind of a grassroots effort to start identifying collectivism and challenging it?
A very good question. I think first, you laid the framework for the action right there. First, you have to identify it, which means you have to understand it, which you have to know what it is. And for most of us, that involves a learning process. And so I would recommend the first stage in this process is to become better informed as to what collectivism is, what its roots are, where the idea came from, and how it evolved throughout history. And we have some excellent material on that for those that want to pursue that at our Reality Zone site. So that would be our realityzone.com. You can find all kinds of books and recordings and videotapes on that topic. And then, having gotten up to speed so we really know what the enemy looks like, so we don't make fools of ourselves, then how do you go about unseating collectivism? Well, now that opens up a big question, and that's why we have Freedom Force International. That's a group of men and women who are determined to do exactly that. Not just know about collectivism, not just worry about it, not just to complain about it, but to actually get mobilized and organized so they can recapture control of the power centers of society away from collectivism and turn these structures back around in the direction of freedom. So anybody that's interested in actually doing something with this knowledge, I really urge them to come and take a serious look at Freedom Force International. Also, for your knowledge base, realityzone.com, www.realityzone.com. And we welcome your feedback. Once again, we have a program dealing with the state of New Hampshire, how to build the perfect country. I would welcome you. There's a feedback category on this website right now. Click onto it. Let us know what your thoughts are about this program, and do you have anything going on in your community where you challenged collectivism? We'd like to hear from you. At Griffin would definitely like to hear from you. Want to review these things, share the information. Let's get it out. As Mr. Griffin pointed out, power is a good thing when it's channeled in the right way, and if you're in a situation where you feel there's something you can do, yes there is. Right here at this website, you can start right now. Check out the feedback. Ed Griffin, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, John.